So hello everyone, a good afternoon. From my part, my name is Matej. I'm a professor of European law here at the University. I'm also the manager of the project that is coming to a close at the end of this month, at the end of June. And this was a project that was dedicated to the integral theory, to the building up of an integral theory on the future of Europe. Today's project already somehow is not concentrated about the conference of the future of Europe that ended a year ago and that the project wanted to examine from a scientific, constitutional, sociological, political, economic perspective. But today's conference centers on what might be coming next in institutional terms. And that's the idea or an intimation of the European Federation. So the question that the conference today will be asking, are we heading towards a European Federation? I know that in this country, probably in particular, to a certain extent, like in the UK, comes across almost as a provocation. It comes across as a provocation because the independence of Slovenia, the gist of the independence of Slovenia was in dissolution of a Yugoslav federal state. And when you're talking to Slovenes, maybe in the streets, or especially to the Slovenian elites, and we might hear also some of that today, they're quite weary about the idea of a European Federation. And it's precisely for that provocative reason that we have to examine this topic. And if we'll be doing well, and I have no doubt about it, this might be a stepping stone for another project in the years to come. So, how are we going to proceed? We will have two panels. The first panel that will be introduced by Katarina Vatovec, who's our assistant professor of European law, will have more academic work. And it will be focusing on the contemporary legal, political, civic, and economic challenges of EU federalism. Each of the participants will have, as Katarina will explain, around 15 minutes to present their topic. Then we will have a discussion, and after the discussion, there will be a coffee break. After the coffee break, we will have a stakeholders panel, as it were, and a bridge that stakeholders panel will be already built by an esteemed colleague, president of the Fiscal Council of the Republic of Slovenia, who is at the same time also an academic. So therefore we have the academic panel building a bridge to the stakeholders panel, discussing really the essence of the question, whether there will be a European Federation. And that panel will be introduced and chaired by Katja Tiller. That's the order of the day. We have three speakers here. One is on Zoom, but Katarina will take over now, and I will sit here in the front and enjoy the conference.
Thank you. I basically have nothing more to add, just to introduce our panelists. I will say that we are again, before we are talking about, we could say, praxis, there will be more elements of the new federalism. And we are joined by Giuseppe, Martinico, a professor of comparative law at Scuola, Superiore, Sant'Anna, by Andrew Glencross, professor of politics and international relations at Université catholique. We welcome Davorin, who, as Matej said, is a professor of economics. A holder of various functions in the past in the executive branch, and now currently a president of the Slovenian Fiscal Council. We are supposed to be joined, as Matej said, I will introduce him nonetheless, and hopefully he will be able to join us soon, by Dimitry Kochenov. Again, I'm very sad he cannot be present. But hopefully he will be present for over Zoom. And Dimitry is a professor of legal studies, and he's currently very close to us at the Central European University in Budapest. So I will ask you, repeat actually what Matej has said. You got each 15 minutes. I was advised to be rather super strict about the time, but we'll see how that goes. I will ask first to Giuseppe, and please, yeah, there, so that you will be able to tackle your PowerPoint. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks indeed. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's always great to be back in Ljubljana. A special thanks go to my friend Matej for organizing this very interesting event. I don't have a paper, so I'm going to present, let's say, some very preliminary thoughts, but I will prepare the PowerPoint presentation. And I'm going to make basically 2 points. Let's see if this works. Yes. I'm going to make 2 points. The first one has to do with the polysemic nature of the concept of constitutionalization in new law, while the second point is about the possible conflicts arising from the pillars of supranational federalism. Will the EU become a federation? Question mark. My answer is maybe yes, but I don't think that is the real question we need to ask ourselves. Indeed, the comparative law showed that federal dynamics can exist even in context formally different from federation or federal state. Also, there were very important things in this respect. This Swiss federal constitution, for instance, defines the country as a confederation. Its Article 3 recognizes sovereignty to the cantons. In 1963, in a very important book, Federal Government, Kenneth Will, one of the eminent scholars in comparative federalism, defined Canada as a form of quasi-federalism. However, going beyond labels, both Switzerland and Canada also show 2 very important examples of multinational federalism. So I believe that beyond the issue of how to define the union, the EU law already has some federal dynamics. And it is a form of functional federalism, as Peter A. wrote in 1966. Or if you want to use the language of catholique, it is a federalizing process already. And indeed, the first scholars used the constitutional jargon to define the European integration process in the 70s and in the 80s had precisely this federal dynamics in mind. This was indeed the case with Eric Stein in his very famous 1981 article, in which he said that the Court of Justice had fashioned a constitutional framework for the federal type structure in Europe. So, in so doing, he combined the constitutional law jargon with the reference to federalism. However, this is only one of the ways in which the concept of constitutionalization is used in European studies. That's why in my title I refer to a clash of constitutionalizations in the plural. Indeed, simplifying a bit the debate, it is possible to find at least 2 notions of constitutionalizations in European studies. By the formula constitutionalization, some scholars mean the emancipation of community law from international law. This is also what Stein had in mind. But a different meaning of constitutionalization is also linked to the progressive humanization of community law. It has to the progressive emergence of fundamental rights at national level, so to the transformation of an area of economic integration into something different, into a space of fundamental rights. This is not a true dichotomy, however, because sometimes this concept of federalization and humanization have been used together. For instance, this is the case with Joseph Weiler in his transformation of Europe. Another example is Pierre Pescatore, for instance, in a piece published in the American Journal of Comparative Law, Fundamental Rights and the Freedom to the of European communities. However, until 2009, okay, I'm failing, let's move. This is the history of my life. I always fail, but okay, so I managed to do that. However, until 2009 at least, there were two parallel literatures on the integration process that developed this two concepts of constitutionalization. In the United States, many scholars who commented on the decisions of the Court of Justice in the pages of American law journals in the 60s and in the 70s used categories of American federalism to describe the case law, the Court of Justice. They used words such as supremacy, preemption, incorporation. They understood direct effect and primacy as the core of a sort of unwritten constitution, which responded to a pattern of evolutionary constitutionalism. In continental Europe instead, on the other hand, much later, I would say, constitutional law scholars instead understood the Charter of Fundamental Rights as the first piece of the Constitution to be written, to be codified. How? By providing the EU with a proper constitutional process, with a proper constitutional power, according to the canon of revolutionary constitutionalism, and according to the contents of Article 16 of the Charter, of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So I said until 2009. Why? Because 2009 is, of course, the year of the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, which meant for some the end of the constitutional ambitions of the Union. But 2009 is also the year of publication of a very important volume, From Dual to Comparative Federalism, that changes the structure of European law, a fundamental book by Davorin, book which rehabilitated the federal approach and the federal journey in European legal study. There are also many differences between these two groups of authors from a methodological point of view. Because for the first group of scholars, many of them were actually European scholars who had migrated to the United States, but for them it was pretty normal to study the European communities by using comparative law. In Europe, instead, the so-called sui generis nature of the community law seemed to prevent any comparison, since comparing the EU with national constitutional systems would have denied the special nature of the European communities, according to them. Against this background, and with reference to the first group of scholars, as Matej wrote, it is possible to argue that the American constitutional experience was also used as a sort of intellectual model underpinning the constitutional narrative of the European integration. And indeed, the champion of this constitutional narrative has been Davorin, who was not surprisingly targeted by Ole Spearman in this very important article, The Other Side of the Story, in which Spearman questioned the constitutional narrative. However, if I were asked to identify the author who first defined the nature of this supranational federalism, I would mention Federale, who wrote in 1966 the seminal book Federalism and Supranational Organizations, in which he identified the pillars of supranationalism. You can find wrong slide. What would happen? Okay, sorry. You can find here a list of features identified by Federale on that occasion. Actually, they're not all, but these seem to be the main ones. So he identified the essence of supranationalism by commenting on the original version of Articles 9 and 13 of the European Core and Steel Community Treaty, namely the articles about the independence of the members of the high authority, the predecessor to the Commission, and the norm about the majority voting in the higher authority. So two features which, in this view, made the European communities very different from the international organization. Now, having clarified these conceptual and terminological aspects, I would like to move on to my second point. This different concept of constitutionalization may collide. This has already happened, and this has already created conflicts, constitutional conflicts, different from those we are used to studying. I mean, we are used to studying those constitutional conflicts occurring between EU law primacy and the supremacy of national constitutions. Here instead, we are dealing with horizontal constitutional conflicts that are internal, that develop within EU law. And let's take the pillars of supranational federalism, namely primacy, that is effect, and mutual trust, to give you some concrete examples of this clash of constitutionalization. An example of this clash between federalization and humanization is indeed caused by mutual trust. Mutual trust is a fundamental principle which, with mutual recognition, resembles the full faith and credit clause of Article 4 of the Constitution of the United States of America. Mutual trust, mutual recognition were formed by the Court of Justice in the field of internal market and then transplanted, applied to other areas where, however, fundamental rights are at stake. This kind of transplant produces some forms of rejection. And here you have some concrete examples of this clash of constitutionalization caused by the mutual trust. In both these cases, Meloni and opinion 2013, mutual trust was used to demonstrate the ancillary position of fundamental rights in EU law. In Meloni, Article 53 of the Charter, fundamental rights was mandated by the Court of Justice. In opinion 2013, the Court of Justice expressly said that fundamental rights must therefore be interpreted and applied within the EU in accordance with the constitutional framework described by the Court of Justice, and in this the constitutional framework, mutual trust played a central role, as we know. Now, the constitutional law scholars shouldn't be so surprised about the possible subversive function of mutual trust in a way, since the entire history of the constitutionalism is actually based on distrust, on the idea of distrust of and in political power. So mutual trust instead is based on mechanisms of automaticity that risk creating zones of immunity from judicial scrutiny. Think of the flaws of the Dublin system. Think of the saga about the European arrest warrant. They're both for confirmation of that. Now, the Court of Justice realizes that after a while, and now it is trying to remedy, some of these flaws, relying on some important cases. For instance, Calderaro and the Lamb, both in the field of the European arrest warrant. So the idea is that the high level of confidence on which the European arrest warrant is based requires proper judicial oversight. And so, there is the possibility for courts to jump in and to, in a way, find exception to this mutual trust. Now, however, these are there is still much to be done. And in this sense, I agree with Matthias Wendel and Gary Scanlon, LM. In this case, the law in general is not sufficient. Also, because the Court of Justice is giving too much power and too much responsibilities to national judges, while probably you should take the lead together with the Commission to guide national judges better. But mutual trust is not the only federal principles which can create issues. Indeed, there are also other principles that should be reconsidered by the institutions. The EU law primacy faces a great challenge today, from the rule of law crisis to the identity politics from liberal populists. How should primacy be adapted in this context? Should we call for a return to an unconditional or to an absolute concept of primacy to deal with this phenomena? Dimitry probably is going to say something about that with regard to the relationship between the rule of law and primacy. But similar challenges are related to the abuse of identity politics, in my view. And national identity, in my view, is not a bad thing per se, especially if we use it properly. So I don't think that the Court of Justice should renounce national identity and Article 4.2 of the Treaty of the European Union. Also, for the Court of Justice, avoiding using Article 4.2 risks leaving terrain for illiberal populists who would instrumentalize the identity argument, as already happened in some judgments of the Hungarian and of the Polish constitutional courts. In this case law, these two constitutional courts used Article 4.2 and the national identity argument as they were detached from the principle of royal cooperation under Article 4.3 in order to justify non-compliance and violation of the basis of the Union and of the fundamental rights principle. This is not acceptable. At the same time, the Court of Justice should use Article 4.2 better. And I can mention here a very bad case in my view, but very clearly in which Article 4.2 was used to cover the stuff that should be governed under other provisions of the treaty. So similar considerations apply to direct effect. And it might seem paradoxical because direct effect is all about giving rights, that we know. But direct effect has changed in nature, that has been already argued, that first it was a feature of those norms capable of passing the Wangen laws test. Later, direct effect has become something different, especially in the cases when the directives are at stake. Because in this case, regardless of the concrete characteristics of the norms included in the directive, we know that these norms cannot have horizontal direct effect. And this horizontal direct effect rule has created inconsistencies in the case of the Court of Justice, compare Foster and Farrell, for instance. And it's also created issues in the protection of fundamental rights. The Court of Justice has tried to deal with that by devising what Advocate General both called the palliatives. But sometimes the problem is that these palliatives have produced shortcomings. Think of the Mangal saga. Think of the reaction, caused at the national level by this option. Not to mention the uncertainty, the confusion concerning the case law of the Court of Justice, where the horizontal direct effect is based on the combination between the norms of the directive and the provisions of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That in this case is broader issue. In conclusion, the EU has already has federal features, federal dynamics, beyond the issue of its new institutional and political form. These federal features, however, need to be readjusted in the light of the progressive importance applied by fundamental rights in the EU. And this is, I think, the most important challenge of supranational federalism today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very much elaborate work. I see Dimitry. Okay, Dimitry, hello. Can you hear us and feel excellent?
More or less. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
That's
can.
spectacular.
So I said at the beginning that it's very unfortunate that you are not here in the same room with us. but at least we have now connection with you, which is that defined, let's say. And were you able to follow the Giuseppe's presentation? Is it okay? Okay.
Yes, everything is fine. It works.
Where he ends, you will probably continue with your rule of law, or I might be wrong, debate. So please, you have 15 minutes.
Wonderful. So I will be slightly less optimistic, probably, and I will explain my reasons. But of course, first, so how to start? EU federalism, blah blah blah, implies that we are in part disagreeing with Weiler's said conclusions from the beginning of the 90s. That what we are dealing with in the system is it's a pane et circenses kind of arrangement that actually, in essence, denies constitutionalism while at the same time proclaiming itself to be a constitutional system. So the EU can only be a modern constitutional system if it meets a basic set of criteria that are promised in Article 2. So it has to be a union of liberal democracies based on the rule of law, which strictly abides by its own legal system, which in itself also respects the same principles. And even the most benevolent overview of the state of the law in Europe today probably would never allow us to agree that these basic, absolutely minimal conditions of European constitutionality are actually met. So let me focus our attention on a couple of those minimal conditions, and I start with something that is repeated at all the levels, virtually every day in the news and also in the university settings, is that the union is not anymore a union of democracies based on the rule of law, which means that this starting point is not met, because it's impossible to speak of a union based on the rule of law when a fake court in one of the member states proclaims that it doesn't feel itself bound by the basic principles such as supremacy of EU law, just to pick one, and that it doesn't sense that Article 6 of CHR, that the very basic due process conditions, is actually in line with one of the key principles of the constitution of that member state. I'm speaking about Poland. Or if we look at all the democracy indices, which indicate that Hungary, unfortunately, falls short of the basic democratic requirements. So in order to be a democracy, the union had to create a robust system of coping with this kind of reality. And the question is open whether this system has been created. So first I give you a positive, in fact, it will be a very positive talk, even though we're dealing with a negative reality. So it is a positive talk because I think the European Union, in particular through the activity of the Court of Justice over the last 5 years, managed to emerge as something that is closer related to its own constitutionalist proclamations than what the situation was 5 years ago. So we all benefited in a way, not the Poles, not the Hungarians, but all Europeans. We benefited from the absolute disarray that is going on the ground in Hungary and Poland. And this is due to a number of factors. Most importantly, this is because the Court of Justice managed to formulate competence for the Union by extending Article 19 in order to intervene in the area of the formation and organization of national judiciary systems, which means that if there is significant backsliding, to use Kim Shapley's wording, then the union potentially can intervene and can solve these problems. But competence is not everything. So the union created competences through the Portuguese judge's case. Then the union acquired some kind of substance of the meaning of independent judiciary, and came up with an idea of the rule of law, which is much more sophisticated and interesting than what we had since the 80s. And I remind you, in the 80s, we had the case law like Lever, where the Court of Justice said the union is a system system based on the rule of law, because all what the union does is in accordance with its own law. This is an absurd circularity, of course. This is not a rule of law definition, because if we apply this definition to Hungary, at least, probably not to Poland, then Hungary is the champion of the rule of law in the European Union. So it's not the member state to be criticized. The rule of law, as understood in Levert, was a denial of any kind of critical thinking about own law, which the European Union is applying. And this is exactly something that is changing today, because today the Court of Justice is coming up with some substantive principles of what the rule of law is about. And then the third element of this transformation is the other enforcement techniques that the Court of Justice is coming up with, including preliminary measures that the court is trying to enforce. And the system is now complete. So the Court of Justice has created a kind of embryonic constitutional system at the supranational level that is closer to a national constitutional ideology, to the national understandings of what is constitutional, compared with what the European Union was 5 years ago with its Levert case law. And so what I summarized basically is the avalanche of dozens and dozens of cases that mushroomed since the Portuguese judge's case. But there is a footnote here, of course. Unfortunately, all this has not changed anything at all at the national level in Poland and Hungary. So we don't see any kind of light in the end of the tunnel. In fact, probably the contrary is true. With the creation of the new Polish panel that will be persecuting Tusk on the assumption that he is kind of a Russian agent. Any kind of change in Poland through lawful political means will be impossible. So Poland is joining Hungary in the camp of basically non-democracies, which could not be less promising if we compare what's going on with what the Court of Justice had in mind when formulating all this new case law, I presume. So then, if we are realistic in our assessment of what has happened, it's all very beautiful on paper and it's all wonderful for the textbooks. The EU now is a better constitutional system because it has competence over crucial values, and it has the substance of values, and it can enforce this. But at the same time, in practice, there is no change at all. So the emperor was naked, as Weiler was hinting at in the 90s, and the emperor remains naked. Only the garb is different, and the garb that we imagine doesn't still cover the emperor, just as was the case in the 90s. But something negative has happened also. So all this was the positive side of the story, and the negative side of the story is not just the lack of results. What allows us to be critical about the case law of the Court of Justice. It's also the emergence of a double standard on all the values and the rule of law, which means that we cannot compare the actual functioning of the rule of law, including all the new substance which the Court of Justice has found at the national level compared with the supranational level. And here we have numerous lines of developments which are all equally worrisome. And I would put the starting point of these developments at opinion 213, when the Court of Justice openly stated that the unique nature of EU law somehow allows it to make concessions in the field of human rights, that not being fully subject to human rights review from Strasbourg is something that is justified. So not protecting the rights of Europeans is justified because of how special the constitutional system is. This is the kind of thinking that would move the Lukashenkos of this world. This is not the kind of thinking that moves a robust functioning constitutional system. But that was just the first sign. And the second sign and the third sign all came in the context of the fight for the rule of law in Poland and Hungary, as compared with what's going on at the supranational level in front of the Court of Justice. And here I have in mind all the avalanche of Sharpston cases, when one of the sitting members of the Constitutional Court constitutional court of the supranational system was mobbed out by the member states against the law, but in divergence to what happened in Poland, where the president of the court, which was attacked, strictly took the side of the judges and the side of the rule of law. What happened at the European level, unfortunately, the court itself sided with the member states in making sure that the law is not observed. And then the court clarified that actually it's not the court's function to review the actions of the member states, even if those actions are openly against the law, and even if those actions basically constitute direct attacks on the independence of the institution and on the legality and lawfulness of its composition. So we had the situation in place for a year after Rantos was appointed as a real advocate general, when the Court of Justice itself was not in compliance with Article 6 case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And here, the President Lennartz was probably happy that they wrote what they wrote in Opinion 213, which means that we had a court which was not lawfully composed at the supranational level. And this is something that is absolutely not acceptable, but we have to live with it because the system is built in such a way that it's very difficult to deal with this kind of situations. And then the third element that I wanted to mention before concluding is how all this affects the principle of trust or distrust. I love Giuseppe's framing of it. A robust constitutional system is premised on distrust. There is absolutely no way of speaking about trust if we want a viable and vivid counterbalancing of different centers of power within a constitutional system. So the distrust went through the roof, because obviously it's very difficult to trust the courts in fake democracies based on fake rule of law, such as Poland, while at the same time it's very difficult to operate the system of trust when the system of trust is policed by a court which itself says that it's not structurally independent, and which itself doesn't even pretend to comply with its own substantial standards of judicial independence and lawfulness of composition. So then, as a result, we have the salami principle, to paraphrase Advocate General Bobik as he then was, which consists in basically pretending that there is no fundamental substance of the rule of law which would bind both levels of the law, the supranational level and the national level. And the main reflection of this principle is the application of preliminary reference procedure in the case of Getin Noble Bank, and there is some offspring of that case, when the Court of Justice, in full knowledge of the fact, accepted questions from a person who was not a judge in the light of ECHR law, because that person was not lawfully appointed, and that person was mentioned by name in ECHR case law as not a lawfully appointed judge. And the Court of Justice told us that actually, although the court was not filled with lawfully appointed judges, as a court, it was still okay in order to ask questions. The problem here is that it was a panel of one, of course. So the court was that flawed individual, and there was no one else to ask the question. So the court, and here I'm speaking about the Court of Justice, the court engages in dialogue with someone whom everybody knows is not a judge, and whom nobody else outside of the courtroom at Kirchberg can call a judge, because Strasbourg case law applies everywhere, but not in those towers in Luxembourg, which means that in the name of judicial dialogue, we have a situation that is created that denies even the most basic starting premises of constitutionalism, on which all the national constitutional systems, all the national authorities agree in the light of what is decided by the Strasbourg Court. And then the very last point, just to drive it all home, it seems that rather than a constitutional system, the EU emerges as a fake constitutional system that uses this constitutional system facade in order to achieve the goals which are absolutely repugnant to the basic values on which the union is set to be organized. And this is what Sarganti, my co-author, and I myself call EU lawlessness law in our recent work. You can look up the paper on the webpage of Weiler's Center at NYU, which is called the EU lawlessness law. And what we suggest is that the European Union uses the complexity of its constitutional architecture in order to help the member states not to comply with the international human rights and other obligations which stem from the basics of the constitutional systems. And the result of this is not pure theory. The result of this are the kidnappings from the Mediterranean organized by the EU, are thousands of deaths and mass crimes perpetrated by EU leadership in cooperation with the leadership of some of the member states, and absolute zero accountability for those crimes. So when we speak about the EU constitutional system, it is the conversation which concerns the only constitutional system in the world which perceives of itself as something of a huge success, with a pending case, actually 2 cases now in front of the International Criminal Court, related to the misconduct by Ms. von der Leyen and others, who as a criminal group organized mass killings of migrants in the Mediterranean, and also the defrauded European taxpayers by funding the prisons operated by Libyan thugs, in direct violation of ECHR and national law. So it's very difficult to praise the EU as a constitutional system at this juncture, but still there were some positive steps taken by the Court of Justice, even though there are no positive results. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitry. As always, which is good and provocative, though we shed some light on the reality, so it's quite fortunate actually to talk about these things. We continue with Andrew.
Yep. Great pleasure to be here at New University, which is in Vatovec, the University of Université catholique, where I work. Thanks to Matej, who just sort of finishing off the paperwork for an Erasmus partnership between our 2 institutions. So I represent SPA, European School of Political and Social Sciences, where I'm now director. And what I want to do when I was given, in a sense, the mandate, the suggestion by Matej, talk about European Federation, is to try and link that to debates that we find contemporary politics, also political science literature, about crises that have been besetting the European Union for a number of years, and which in a sense are things that touch on especially what Dimitry was saying when it comes to, say, migration crisis. So if I think about this context about polycrisis, about EU constitutionalism, how it operates as a quasi-federation, like Giuseppe just said before, is it able to the next slide? Then it reminded me of a tweet I saw summer last year by the former Finnish Prime Minister, Alexander Stubb, and who is now director of the School of Transnational Governance, the European University Institute, and he was tweeting about the past, comparing the past to kind of crises that we might have had in the early noughties, institutional enlargement negotiations, competitiveness, and thinking, well, were they the good old days when things were perhaps boring, more in a sense simple, innocent, if you will. That's why he's talking about it in terms of crisis nostalgia. If you compare summer 2022 with those kind of issues that were at the top of the EU's political agenda back 20 or more years ago. And I think there's actually a lot to be said for that. I mean, I remember those years as well, more or less well, and it was quite optimistic to be, for instance, for the European University Institute, again with Matej, 2003, you know, people were talking about enlargement. It was something that was quite positive, despite some misgivings, some member states where I work now, France, for instance, perhaps. But in general, it's quite optimistic. Institutional reform was something that was seen as charter of fundamental rights, something that there was positive momentum for as well there. There was some dark clouds. You don't have to go too far to find them as well. When it comes to, say, Berlin and Paris, taking a really very different line from, say, Warsaw or London when it comes to American response to Saddam Hussein in 2003. Fast forward 2 years, the optimism of the Constitutional Convention, the Constitutional Treaty, that all dissipates after the referendums not in Spain, that's also had referendums, they were there, yes, but in France and the Netherlands. So some dark clouds as well. But you compare that to where we're at today, and you have to say that Storm is probably right, that there are really reasons not to be cheerful at all. We've had a member state leave the EU because of, in a sense, a process created by the Constitutional Convention. We could say we have the ongoing rule of law crisis that Dimitry has outlined particularly nicely. We've got problems when it comes to this consensus on foreign policy for big topics that will become even bigger, like China, support for Ukraine, of course, how you sanction, what you sanction Russia for, etc. We've had that ongoing since 2014. Current proposals led by the German government to try and move away from unanimity in common and foreign security policy. So lots of reasons not to be cheerful, I think, of late. But I would actually say that if you think about this idea that things were less dramatic, more innocent 20 years ago, we now have a moment of poly crisis, everything has really gone to pot. I don't think that narrative is particularly helpful, and I think it's unnecessarily alarmist, even to some degree, because actually, if you want to have a more sober assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of the EU's federal-like constitution, I think you need to have a proper yardstick. You need to have a proper way of measuring what a constitutional crisis in a federation actually looks like, and on that basis, get some sense of how well or not the EU system has responded to those kind of crises. So, if I go to my colleague who runs the Salga, who has written a lot about EU and crises, as well as crises in general, we use her definition of what constitutes a crisis, I think we can get a lot more purchase on the strengths and weaknesses of the EU federal system. So in her definition, concept of crisis refers to a situation that basically meets three conditions: threatens the high priority goals of the decision-making unit, restricts the amount of time available for response before the decision is transformed, and thirdly, surprises the members of the decision-making unit by its occurrence. So those are three conditions for a political, and dare I say, a constitutional crisis. So if we use that definition, we apply that to those three things that Sturb was talking about, waxing lyrical, becoming nostalgic about from the early noughties: institutional reform, enlargement negotiations, the debate about making the EU competitive against the US. Also, there's a realization that China and India are emerging. We apply that lens, that definition. I don't think those things were even crises in the first place. Yeah? I mean, institutional reform, competitiveness, they're not surprising. They're things that people are looking at and have been for a long time. So if we really want to go further, I think we need to think about a crisis more as a test of constitutionalism. And so I think we need a different kind of, in a sense, frame of reference. And here the obvious one, I think, would be John Elster, to talk about constitutions as chains imposed by Peter when sober on Peter when drunk. Yeah, you make, in a sense, not just promises, but you give yourself real constraints for those moments of weakness, the moments when you're drunk, the moments when you can't make a sober, well-grounded decision. So on that basis, if we use the Elster model and we think about what a constitutional crisis might be in a federal system, I think the crisis number one would be: do the constitutional chains get broken by that particular crisis, or by a set of crises, polycrises? So that is, are you having to resort to rule by emergency at the expense of constitutional prerogatives of the federal units? Are you breaking the chains that you've put in place? Secondly, are the chains too restrictive? are the chains so restrictive, constitutionally speaking, that you get some kind of decision-making paralysis? Because if we look back to the quote from Zalga, if you don't make a decision quickly, efficiently, you might get surprised by how things, in a sense, spiral out of control. You can think back to the migration crisis, perhaps 2015, 2016, for a good example of that, or invasion of full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year. And so on that basis, do we see decision-making paralysis because of a lack of coordination between the different components of the federal system? Yeah. And so let's have a look at the recent record then, because Stubb was saying, well, there are lots of existential problems, it's a poly crisis. What's the recent record if we use that kind of yardstick? Do we see decision-making paralysis? Do we see rule by emergency decree? Look at Brexit, that's clearly not a great situation, but on the EU side, very different on the UK side, but on the EU side, I don't see emergency measures having to be imposed to try and address that. I don't see decision-making gridlock. If anything, there's a big consensus about managing it in an orderly fashion, in particular with support for the Republic of Ireland. Then you've got something that really is a surprise. Yeah, that really fits that third criterion of Zalga. COVID, yeah, this comes out of nowhere, although actually by the back I had colleagues from China who were saying something big is coming. So, you know, there were indications, but still, that's a real shock to the system, yeah? So there, what do you see? Well, you have some temptation, some issues to do with being stuck between trying to have national protectionism. One of the first things France, Germany does in March 2020 is start restricting exports of so-called medical countermeasures, so masks, protective gowns, completely against the single market, of course, yeah? And the Commission has been moving pretty quickly on that front as well. There's also EU-wide solidarity measures, the vaccine procurement system, yeah? Would a country like Slovenia have been able to beat Germany to access the vaccine on the same terms? I very much doubt that, yeah? So on that basis, again, I think the outcome there is pretty positive. You don't really have to resort to emergency measures against the will of one or more member states. You don't really have, I think, a good example of decision-making paralysis, except maybe really right at the beginning. And therefore, I think that is actually quite a positive outcome. When viewed against that test, paralysis or emergency decree. Finally, another example would be the response to what's happened in Ukraine over the last year or more. And then, if you say military aid certainly has to be very coordinated across member states, is that really a prerogative of the EU? Not necessarily, but in other areas, sanction policy, refugee policy, a lot of coordination. And I don't think either you would see, in a sense, countries being overruled. They might be sort of guided along that process, and there might be some horse trading. Think about situation with Hungary, for instance. But I think you've got decisions. You also, in a sense, have a good amount of support for financial aid. Also, most recently, the ASAP legislation to try and actually supply weapons procurement programs for Ukraine. So I don't think that is actually an example of either of those, in a sense, tests being a failure. So on that basis, I would conclude then that existing EU constitutionalism, if we look at that as a whole in terms of federal, in a sense, criterion about successful or unsuccessful management of crises, it's actually quite resilient. A resilient mechanism for responding to crises, balancing out the threat, in a sense, of decision-making crisis, and the other extreme, which is having to impose your will against the prerogatives of member states or units. And so on that basis, I think got some reason for optimism, but to go back to what Dimitry was saying before, maybe under the surface, the story is less positive actually. Under the surface, on the basis of saying that actually, what we might think of as the biggest risk isn't democratic rights. We've been able, in a sense, things like Brexit, Ukraine, COVID, being able to avoid that, but the real risk, the latent risk, the underlying risk is perhaps something that you could say is best labeled democratic paralysis. The idea then, if you've got this system, a federal system, a union of states and of citizens, then you need to find an equilibrium. You need to find something that might differ in how that equilibrium operates at any one moment, but an equilibrium in terms of that duality. The problem then becomes if you start having a risk of trying to impose one over the other, then you might have some kind of democratic paralysis that leads to a decision-making paralysis. So on that basis, I think EU federal system, that constitutional system, quite good at responding, so you might think, to some of these recent crises, is actually its most brittle, it's most vulnerable when you actually have a real existential, in a sense, democratic contest between the EU level and the national level. Yeah, the idea that if you have a contest about saying ultimately we need to resolve, we need to decide, we might do that by a referendum, we might even see that through an election system or some other kind of political channel, that one level is actually inherently superior, politically speaking, able to, in a sense, set limits, a bit like what the Polish Constitutional Court is saying when it comes to primacy. If we have that, then I think you start having the risk really of a democratic paralysis leading to a decision-making paralysis. That's why I would say that something I haven't talked about is actually the biggest current threat, which is if you think about contesting the EU from within, that whole rule of law dimension actually becomes much more problematic if you start saying, well, we only have two entities, not a duality, either going to be the EU or the national level, but in a sense is superior, then that successful, in a sense, recipe, you could say, the dealing with these crises is actually going to be undermined. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Your comment is by Davorin, who will probably, yes, EU economic governance and the question of probably building, elaborating on fiscal union. Yes, we hear it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, Matej, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to speak to you from a different angle. Now, I was listening carefully to the legal aspects of federalism, but let me turn now to the economic aspects. Well, but when speaking about European federalism, I remember it's almost 30 years ago when I visited Great Britain. That time Foreign Minister Sir Malcolm Rifkin. Well, I was also then in the capacity of Foreign Minister, and Slovenia was in that time not a member of the European Union. It was not even a candidate for membership, and there was a very high uncertainty because Slovenia also faced some not very friendly steps from some neighbors. For instance, Italy put some obstacles in the days to Slovenian way towards the European Union, and so we had to go to every particular member of the European Union and ask them, do you support us? And so I was in Great Britain, and I asked British Foreign Minister Rifkin, do you support us? And he said, yes, we do support you because we want European Union enlargement, but we do not want European Union deepening. We do not want European Federation. So Brexit was not a surprise for me, because the European Federation is something that many countries, that many political entities actually cannot stand. But on the other hand, a clean model of monetary union demands a fiscal union as a complement. We are in fiscal policy or in economic governance, or we are interdependent. But some member states are concerned about the loss of national sovereignty, about the control of our budgets. There are also debates about the distribution of fiscal responsibilities, of risk sharing. So I think there will be many discussions before the closer cooperation or something that is similar to the fiscal union as a part of the European Federation will be made. So now we see that the fiscal rules can also be seen as a substitute or an intermediate step towards a fiscal union in the European context. So to operate efficiently and I want it back. Okay. Oh. Okay, that's the right slide. Well, so to operate efficiently and to reach the goals of economic and monetary union, monetary policy requires a complementary support by fiscal policy, and it works on the ground of common concerns. And also European Union should reduce the possibility of free riding of some member states, of causing unfavorable spillovers and tensions in highly integrated financial markets. But fiscal policies at EU and at national levels tend to have different goals. So political, due to different focuses, and economic, the cyclical positions are not always synchronized, and it means also to divergences. Now we have the European fiscal rules. But due to escape clause, those fiscal rules were not fully enforced for the last 3 years, and it gave us a break to think about: can we, after escape clause, return to the old rules that have many snag points? So the existing framework is alright complex. It has Vademecum has 200 pages, and the methodology is pro-cyclical. How to measure or measuring the structural balance brings the conclusions of economic policy measures that are pro-cyclical and thus are not productive to use in every situation. Also, the existing fiscal rules are short-term oriented, year by year instead of medium term. Also, there is a lot of political interference, and there are not always enforcement. And also, what could be important, the political elite in many countries are presenting the fiscal rules as Brussels own. So something that has nothing to do with national interests, with national governance, but that is something that has been introduced by a level from which the countries are alienated. And we also have recorded some consequences of inadequate fiscal governance framework. The possibility of making huge errors is increasing in terms of policy orientation. Also, the existing fiscal rules are not ensuring fiscal sustainability and is not providing sufficient space for macroeconomic stabilization. Sometimes they are dealing with minor instead of with gross errors of fiscal policy. And there is increased political interference in economic decisions by the Commission. Also, there are huge heterogeneities in fiscal developments among the member states. For instance, if we only go to the debt rule, where the position of member states is much different. The basic rule is that the member states will tend towards 60% of GDP debt, which should be sustainable. But the majority of the member states are much over the 60%, and there are even states that, according to the existing rules, that 1/20th share of the excess or 60% should be reduced every year. It is perhaps viable for the countries which has 70 or 80% debt in GDP, but of course not for countries over 100%. But among those countries with over 100% are big and important members of European Union. So something must be done also in order to make the fiscal rules available and useful for the countries which are not in theoretical position, So there are efforts to make the rules less complex. There are also efforts to gain on importance of medium-term budgetary framework. But debt sustainability is in the forefront. Based on debt sustainability, there are many variations introduced amongst member states regarding the required adjustments. So, according to the proposal of new rules, each member state will have its individual plan of adjustment to the debt rule, and it will. But we know that it will take different time. It depends on the starting position, and also the tendency to that the rules are home-owned. We should also the population and the political agents of all member states should take the fiscal rules as their own rules, not as something that is imposed from Brussels. Now, the question is, could the change European Union economic governance framework lead to more European integration? There are some advantages, but certain characteristics bring along some doubts in the success of the proposed framework. First, home ownership. On one hand, we are advocating home ownership, but on the other hand, it seems that the European Commission will have a high discretion when we deal with the fiscal structure plans with the member states. And there is always danger of dominance of the European Commission against the member states. Also, when we are making our plans due to medium-term orientation, inadequate assumption in the beginning can bring to long-term projections that may make large differences. Also, counter-cyclicity. some problematic key indicators of the current framework remain present, albeit they have moved to the background. For instance, the Slovenian Act on fiscal rule also has an article where the structural balance is defined, and it is defined on the way that can lead to pro-cyclical results. And also there are doubts about the possibility of enforcement, because on one hand we have the European Commission, on the other hand we have the possibility of member states, independent fiscal institutions to do their work, but they have no official mandate. The independent fiscal institution are working on the base comply or explain, so the government can go over the position of independent fiscal institutions simply by getting a majority in the parliament. Well, what else besides the new system of economic governments can bring a closer cooperation between the member state countries? So what is left to economic federalism? There is also an I would say institution that is again not everybody's cup of tea. This is a centralized fiscal capacity. It will make more maneuvering space in common fiscal policy, but there are many views in member states that this perhaps is not the right decision and not the right way to enforce the fiscal union, although it has this idea has much support by European Fiscal Board and by IMF. So, what can we conclude? Of course, the debate on the ways towards future of fiscal integration in the European Union continues, and finding the right balance between national sovereignty and deeper fiscal integration remains a complex challenge. The European Union perhaps should strengthen the framework for coordination and convergence of fiscal policies and ensure the responsible fiscal behavior of member states. But we should allow also countries to maintain a certain degree of autonomy in their budgetary decision. In any case, there is a high degree of fiscal and economic interdependence, and those challenges need to be addressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thank all four panelists, and I open the floor for questions. Please. Yeah. Okay, please, Matej.
Yes, but take the time, let me be quick. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation on four of them. The main notion that stuck with me, and that is no surprise, is of course the idea of what the Professor Kračun said towards the end. The question of the right balance. And this is the gist of federalism. And all of you somehow share the idea that that this right balance might be increasingly hard to achieve. Whereas Dimitry has said, well, the EU as such, together with the member states, is in a way abusing this right, the lack of the right balance to do vicious things. And now my question is, and this is the gist of federalism, of course, how would the right balance be achieved? And this is essentially finally, eventually, this is a political question. It cannot be resolved solely through your perspective, which was rightly so legal, and it was touching on it. And of course, Mr. Kračun was also mentioning the economic dimension. And I'm not quite sure, and I'd be interested to hear that from Dimitry, the land in this question. What to do about the system which has become vicious? Those are the things.
Thank you. Someone else? Okay, then I will give the floor like this. Okay, first.
Well, you're right, but indeed, they also pointed out that when commenting on the Swiss governments, the I immediately said that the solution reached by the Court of Justice in pandemic is now, because they tend to, I mean, delegate too much power to national judges, but national courts, and the same applies to the Court of Justice, don't act in matter. I mean, they need to act. That's why I agree with those who said that the Commission, the European Parliament, could do a bit more. I mean, also the Court of Justice perhaps, but this is not a thing that it is solved by the only, and because constitutional rulers sometimes can put too much pressure on the courts. This is the classic thing that in my view, I mean, could be solved only by performing the treaty. So by perhaps introducing the possibility of kicking a member out of the system. But of course, a reform like this, it will lead to unanimity, and I don't think that this can be solved. So in the absence of this solution, perhaps these attempts, I mean, at having a sort of dialogue with all the flows that currently, I mean, Dimitry has pointed out, now are the only possible the strategy, trying to, I mean, create the consensus, try to explain better what the European Union is doing, because we academics frequently tend to be part of the wrong narrative, meaning we tend sometimes to they do only as a set of states, but they use much more. It is also, I mean, it gives an Avbelj. So probably we should, I mean, and the institution the same time to reach, I mean, the population of this language and try to explain better from what it is doing. I don't see an academic motion, I mean, unfortunately. So in this sense, I agree with Dimitry, the most respected as being a constitutional lawyer, I believe in his trust. So I know this is not an optimistic, I mean, picture, but this is what I can say. Thank you very much.
Dimitry, it's your turn.
I wonder whether the problem is abuse or the right use of the EU as designed at the moment, because what we see in the Mediterranean and what we see with the member states dismissing Advocate General Sharpson from the court, it seems like non-application of Article 2 values as we expect them to apply at the national level. To the supranational level is something that the member states view as an invitation to benefit from precisely the non-compliance, which means that we're speaking about the functioning of the system as designed, but then this system emerges as something that is deeply contradictory if we expect to see liberal constitutionalism at the supranational level. And then we can return to the old debate about democracy deficit. We can return to the old debate about justice deficit at the supranational level. But we're constantly reminded of the acuteness of those conversations, unfortunately. So to my mind, giving any more power to the supranational level before basic accountability and basic respect of the values is established at that level would be a deep mistake. So any member state skeptical of the EU, no matter what the reasons which are stated are, actually is a member state that undermines the potential of its peers to use the EU as a mechanism in an abusive way. And as a strongly pro-European lawyer, I never thought I would come to this conclusion. But to me, it seems like rethinking the governance at the supranational level is the next fundamental step, which is indispensable in order to reinforce in order to reinforce EU federalism. I will stop here.
Thank you.
So a system that become vicious, yeah, I don't think I accept the premise. I mean, the idea of extrapolating from the really nasty consequences of the EU migration policy. But in that context, I mean, there's trade-offs about border security and the kind of deals that may be required to maintain a border security policy that is in line with public expectations, public demands even. That's not unique to EU federalism. Those trade-offs exist at the national level, they exist in other countries outside Europe, Israel, the US, etc. Yeah. So I don't really think I accept that particular premise. What I would say though is, in itself, migration policy with its nasty delegation of responsibility to Libyan coast guards, the Turkish deal 2016. What all of that is an illustration precisely of that answer gap. Because if you don't have those deals, you don't have Schengen. Yeah? And Schengen is a big deal in a place like Slovenia, other countries, which what Croatia have to do to try and get in as well. But if you don't have that, then you can't do that balance. So in a sense, it's a bit like not just balancing, but like a juggler where these lots of balls in the air. And in that context, you have an alternative, which is not Schengen, which is the national alternative. The supranational alternative is Schengen plus an EU border policy that has those deals, but the national countries do those deals anyway, in a sense. I don't think that's unique in the sense of the system becoming vicious to EU federalism. Actually, the member states are not independent. We all depend on financial markets because there are billions of euros of bonds that must be sold every year in order to maintain the finance of the countries. So, what is the right balance? The right balance is that can on which the financial markets or the investors on financial markets are convinced that they can trust that the European Union and the member states are reliable enough to put them money to use it for the I don't know, 10, 20, or even 100 years. So the reliability, the trust is on financial market is that who gives the dimension of balance that we should reach in our economic governance.
Thank you. Any other question? I will just ask and then we conclude. Matej asked the question of the right balance. We were discussing you and Dimitry regarding the rule of law crisis. Some, rich countries rely on this national identity arguments to argue that what they believe is the correct way, and the EU should not interfere. We had a conference a week ago. And someone said, Poland said, this question is the eternal question of the constitutional court, the circumstances or the relationship between the judges among the constitutional court and the perception of the constitutional court in Poland. This is an internal election, it's not a question of EU. So I'm thinking, is the internalization of values, of European values that are written now, at all possible, so that we can speak that what we have, national identity, this national identity, in fact, part of this national identity is our European identity. So that there wouldn't be any more these huge discrepancies between member states themselves, but also between the EU and member states, which you mentioned, the supranational level and national level. Is this possible, or how it is feasible, basically, to achieve? Please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, the the kind of interpretation supported by the Hungarian and more recently by the Constitutional Court that not pass the extent of the EU law. Really, I mean, because they tend to detach, they contextualize a paragraph of the norm from the rest of the norm. It's pretty clear in linking the use of national identity to the respect of law and cooperation. So you may not use a national identity if it were the kind of field that can be treated in a critical manner, something which should resemble a very old-fashioned understanding of crime. This is not what the EU treaty says, and that's why I do believe that it is possible to obtain the potential of Article 4.2. Second point, what you suggest, I think, is already in the treaties. There are indeed the orders best but also Andras mentioned that. According to them, Article 7, which is this kind of literature we have, will be the only article which would support the sort of ultra-vires intervention of the EU. Why? Because the values of Article 2 are understood as shared. So they are already the parts of the national and supranational constitutional identity. This is also what the Court of Justice, in my view, suggested in the judgments about the conditionality regulation. So when it uses for the first time the notion of constitutional identity of the Union, I don't know if this strategy is a smart move. Because I mean, speaking of the constitutional identity of the European Union, but I think it is based on this kind of reading. That's why they can intervene, I mean, bypassing the argument of these are purely internal situations. The data that they are shared in their form. Having said that, let me also say that we that sometimes we tend to neglect that even in other robust federal systems, conflict like this frequently happen. I mean, I always mention, of course, in Canada, but also in the US, all the nullification prices, but also what is happening right now. Can we see that perhaps we are paying the price of the broader crisis of the liberal constitutionality in general? And can we say that also the US and the laws, perhaps we have a sort of global crisis? So there is a broader plan. The problem is the constitutional design, and in this time that with Matej, that is they need to find the right balance.
Thank you, Dimitry. Yes.
Yeah, could I? Well, in general, I agree, but I would love to strongly disagree, actually, because to me, the EU started emerging as a constitutional system precisely as a result of a successful deployment of constitutional identity arguments by Germany, by Italy, and by other member states. I am thinking about the Zolangi cases, and I'm thinking about the emergence of the EU as a human rights organization, which means that all kinds of arguments can be deployed proactively on the side of liberal constitutionalism or on the side of something else. And in this sense, simply putting a cross on some kind of arguments out of principle procedurally before looking at where they lead us could be potentially problematic. So in this sense, it doesn't actually matter what Hungarians or the Poles say in terms of their constitutional identity, because what I see on the ground, especially in the field of migration, which directly relates to the rule of law, is much more problematic, because we have strong solidarity between all the member states on the one hand and the EU on the other in acting against the values of Article 2 without actually listing any kind of arguments. So when I hear in the news that Frontex decided to withdraw from Hungary because of the Hungarian approaches to migration, it's difficult to comment on this kind of news, looking at thousands of people who die in the Mediterranean in the hands of so-called mature democracies, such as Greece, such as Italy, such as Malta, etc., which means that behind the scenes, we have strong anti-constitutional solidarity between the member states, where the member states use and abuse EU law in order to commit mass atrocities de facto. And this is something that that we'll need to deal with. So before shutting up the mouth of those who would say, actually, we don't buy supremacy because supremacy can kill, we should rebuild the union in such a way that it cannot actually act as an actor of injustice. And this to me seems to be the crux of the matter.
Thank you. Would you like to add something, Patrick?
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, I think what I would say is that there is two versions of European identity. There's one with the EU as part of that European identity. There's a European identity without the EU. Yeah, you go to people who supported Brexit, you go to people like Marine Le Pen in my country, France, they'll say we want Europe because they the EU. So on that basis, you know, I think we have to be able to differentiate the fact that the European identity means something more potentially than just being pro EU. And on that basis, then, if we think through the consequences, then that's fine if we then act on it, say, leave the EU, but if you also try to say it, but don't act on it, think about, say, Hungary, what are you doing then at the national level? If you say that, you know, you actually don't want a Europe with the EU, you want a different of Europe perhaps, well then, in essence, you're free riding on the single market, you're free riding on the trust, for instance, that financial markets might have, and therefore there should be consequences, presumably, if you really, at the national level as a government, depend on identity that is European without the EU.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there are efforts to make the fiscal rules home-owned, because the practice was that there was a differentiation between the national interest and the interest of European Commission or of the European Union as a whole, and this is that the new economic governance should solve through the institution of home ownership of fiscal rules. It means that every country should, and also political agencies in every country should understand that the rules are for their own good, that the rules are in order to make the authorities in each country fiscally responsible, and that this is not just a caprice of the European Commission, but that this is a genuine interest of each country, and of course, each country has every time to appear on financial markets with selling bonds, and that is also a strong argument to home-own the principles of economic governance of the European Union.
Thank you. Now you said fiscal responsibility. I say it's my responsibility that we are 5 minutes late. I'm taking 5 minutes of your break, so I do apologize, but I thank all of you, Dimitry, for as well for a great debate, which I hope will continue now and 2 hours later, if I'm there. So thank you all, and wish you were here.